Well, we are coming up with the spring holy days soon, the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. If you turn back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we have an admonition here about keeping these days that will be here before we know it, really. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and beginning in verse 8, a very familiar passage to us, where it says, "Let us therefore keep the feast." Of course, this is to the Corinthian church, a Gentile church, but they were keeping the feast of unleavened bread. It says, "Let us therefore keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." When we read those words of sincerity and truth, I think, of course, we oftentimes focus on the concept of truth. Truth is very important. For many in the world, truth isn't so important. It's tradition that matters more than truth. And we recognize the importance of truth, but what about sincerity? When you read the word, keep the feast with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, what does sincerity mean to you? Perhaps it conjures up different connotations depending on the context, but what does it mean to you here? There's a story, a great story, I think, that illustrates the idea of sincerity. And you've probably heard it. I think it's been written about in magazines, church magazines in the past, been talked about in sermonettes. I'll just rehearse it for you. If you lived in Corinth in ancient times, you might have found it difficult to shop for quality goods. They didn't have a Walmart, so it's hard to find quality goods. At least when you go to Walmart, you kind of know what you're getting, right? But in Corinth at that time, if you were trying to pick out a good quality clay pot, for example, it wasn't always easy. Dishonest merchants would sell cracked clay pots as if they were fine, as if nothing was wrong with them. I did a little research on drying clay. I know some of you have done this type of thing, pottery, in the past, and you know that there's a certain art and science to drying that pottery in such a way that it doesn't crack, because if it dries at different rates, part of it will crack when other parts won't. So there is a science and an art to it. But they would go ahead and sell these, and as the story goes, they would fill the blemishes or the cracks with wax. And they would just color or paint the outside of it so that the wax didn't show. And when you take the pot home, fill it with hot water, of course, the wax begins to melt, and you realize that you have a pot that is imperfect and won't hold liquid like you thought. The outside of the pot looked fine, but they had disguised it and covered up the blemishes. Honest tradesmen, back at that time, anciently, began to label their good quality pots with the words sincerity, or sincerity, which means without wax. Now, there's no wax filling in the cracks. And anyone who bought a pot that said sincerity, or as we look at the word sincere, they knew they were getting a pot that was without cracks. It was solid. And as the story goes, without wax is the root of the English word sincere, or sincerity. And I've known people over the years, and in fact, I think one of my Bibles I have without wax beside the word sincere. So as I was studying, preparing for this sermonette, I thought, well, what an interesting story. It really gives the idea that being without wax, being pure, not being hypocritical, not showing ourselves to be one way when we're really full of guile or cracks or sin, means not being deceptive, means being authentic, being real, not pretending we're something we're not. That's a wonderful story to illustrate that. Problem is when I looked into it, I realized that the story wasn't all it was cracked up to be. I can't tell the story in all sincerity because there is one crack, one flaw in the story. Now, it's a memorable story, to be sure, and as I'll explain in a little while, there's a reason to value this story, but there is a falsehood there. A falsehood that has been told and retold for generations. In fact, the idea goes all the way back to the 1600s. It's been told so many times. You look at it, look at the story on blogs and articles, you'll find it told numerous ways. In fact, one of the stories goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans who created statues, supposedly marble statues, stone statues, that when there was a flaw, they would cover that with wax. And that's one of the stories. And if the statue was authentic, it was without wax, or sincere, sincerity. And so that's said to be the origin. The oldest stories go back to, as I said, one goes back to the 1600s, where there's the old myth that the ancient Romans, some of them would melt wax into their honey. Now, if you've kept bees before, you know there's wax together with the honey, but they would melt the wax in with it and sell it as though it was authentic, pure honey. And so all the way back in the 1600s, the story goes that they would sell their honey without wax, or sincere, as the Latin would be. And that's really where the idea comes from, is the Latin sincere, where we get the English word sincere. John Gill, in his complete body of doctrinal and practical divinity back in 1796, wrote that the Latin word sincerus, from whence the English word sincere is composed, signifies without wax, as pure honey, not mixed with any wax. And one of the definitions from a dictionary published in 1661 says that sincere is that which is without mixture, as honey without wax. So this idea goes back a long way. And if sometime in the future I tell this story forgetting what I said today, then please remind me as I get older. But there's one thing about this story that isn't quite true. Where is the crack? Well, it's in the idea that the English word, our English word sincere, is derived from the Latin sincere. Or as we look at it, it looks very similar to sincere. It would be actually pronounced sincera in the Latin. Many sources say that our English word comes from that Latin word. But in fact, there's no evidence it does, other than the actual stories. It's called a etymological folk tale or myth. That the English word comes from that. Now, if you go to Google and you type in the word without, English word without, and translate it to Latin, it will say sin. If you type in the word wax, English word wax, and translate it to Latin, it will say cere, or sincere. So in that sense, it certainly seems to fit. So you can imagine why people would think that it had that etymological or origin, but the fact is it doesn't, according to the most renowned sources. In fact, the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the standard when it comes to the origin of words, says that it almost certainly did not come from the idea of without wax. Another prominent etymological study says it probably comes from a Latin which means of one growth or of one whole. One whole. In other words, the idea is that it is indeed pure. It's one. So the concept of being both clay and wax wouldn't be sincere, still would have a problem. But the idea that the English word comes from that is a myth. So that is the crack. The question is there still something we can learn from the story? Is there still something we can learn? Now, when you think of sincere, again, what do you think of? I think oftentimes the word sincere can carry a couple of connotations that maybe the Bible doesn't intend. For example, one is to have a pure motive, but to do something wasn't quite right. I saw an episode of Gunsmoke as I was recovering from my surgery. I found Gunsmoke to be comforting in old westerns where most of those people are dead, but you're still alive at least. I watched this episode of Gunsmoke, and a few of the merchants in town get very frustrated with this self-righteous guy that's saying they're all a bunch of sinners, and he tries to burn down the local saloon, which is a bad no-no in Gunsmokeville. So he burned it down, the saloon, and they got upset with him. They decided they weren't going to hang him, but they would dunk him in the town water, the water thing that holds all the water for the town. They dunk him in there a few times, wrapped him in a bag, and put him on top of the pole and had a rope, and they put him down in there, pulled him up, put him down in there, pulled him up, just to teach him a lesson, right? As they're going to get him out after the third time, the pole broke. And he goes into the water, and they try to get him out, but he's dead. He drowned. And as sheriff comes by finding out what's going on, they explain, we had the best of intentions, Sheriff. We didn't mean to do anything wrong. The pole broke. They were sincere. They honestly were trying to teach him a lesson, but someone died. And oftentimes that's the way we can look at sincere as someone, well, they had a good heart. You know, they meant it well, but it wasn't really the right thing to do. We're going to see that word is that's not really the meaning of the Greek, which the Bible was written. Another way we can look at sincere is, hey, I am who I am. Me, all my flaws, take me or leave me. I don't care. Yes, I got a problem. I'm rude sometimes. I don't care. I am who I am. I'm sincere. Hey, I have a problem with drinking, but everybody knows it. I'm sincere. I'm not covering anything up. I'm selfish sometimes, but everybody knows it. Therefore, I'm sincere. Well, maybe you're not covering the cracks with wax, but at the same time, is that what the biblical word means? The word in the Greek actually means pure. That's a very good translation. Pure, unadulterated, not mixed with anything else. Very similar to the story of not mixing wax with clay. Still a very valid story and a very valid point. Again, the only problem with it is the idea that the English word sincere comes from without wax. But it does mean pure. In fact, the word that most Greek scholars think that the original Greek word comes from actually means to be examined in the sunlight, to be viewed in the sunlight, to be found to be pure. To take something and to really examine it closely, and you find that it is genuinely pure. The Bible speaks of us, and we won't turn there, but Malachi chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, or 2 and 3, talks about God being like the refiner, or having the soap, and He washes us, He cleanses us, He refines us, so the impurities in us can go away, can be dealt with. So the Greek word, which is really the language that Paul wrote in, simply means pure, unadulterated, unalloyed. There's nothing else there. It's whole. What you see is pure. It is the way it should be. It is not just having a good heart, but messing up all the time. And it's not showing ourselves to be impure, but at least we're honest about it, as the English words can sometimes imply. Actually, the story of the pot is a good one. It does illustrate something. There's another version of the story that says that a customer in ancient Rome and Corinth and various places had learned to take those clay pots out into the sunlight and look into it, and turn it around. If they saw light coming in, they would know that there's a flaw. And that's exactly what the Greek word means, to examine under sunlight and to be pure. The question I have for us as we prepare for the spring holy days is, are we pure? Are we sincere in the biblical sense? Not in the English word sense or the Latin word sense, but in the biblical word. Are we pure? If we're held up to the sunlight, what does God see? If we hold ourselves up to the sunlight, do we see purity? Well, I think we can all answer the question and say that, no, there's some cracks sometimes. There are some cracks. During the Passover and Days of Unleavened Bread, we are reminded that we are freed from sin and death. We're freed from the slavery of sin. When we see the cracks, you and I, we're not dried yet. God is a master. He is the potter. He's still shaping us. We haven't dried completely. God can work out the cracks. He can work out the problems if we're willing to allow Him to do so. We're still in the process of being formed. So when we see cracks, we don't have to fill them in with wax, pretend they don't exist. We can actually ask God to help us overcome. And that's part of what these upcoming spring holy days is all about. To see the cracks, to examine ourselves, as it says in 1 Corinthians 11, let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. This is a time that we need to begin thinking about examining ourselves. Do we see the cracks? What can we do to overcome? Bring ourselves out into the sunlight. Take a good, honest look at ourselves. Hopefully, we can learn a lesson from sincere. No, it doesn't come from the Latin sincerity, but it does mean pure. And the story that goes along with the ancient stories that go along with that, even though the etymological root isn't there, it still very much illustrates the idea that we're looking for. We're looking to be pure as God is pure.